Welcome everyone, Questini here with a discussion about the Forge of the Chaos Dwarves for Total War Warhammer 3, Immortal Empires, and why it is such a good race pack, why it's such a good DLC besides the price. The price is still very high even for them, make no mistake about that. $25 even for the Chaos Dwarves is still an issue, let alone for something like Shadows of Change. But Creative Assembly did clearly put in a significant amount of effort with regards to this DLC and with regards to this race. Now, what they did with this DLC, I might add, that benefits everyone that has a campaign in this area of the Darklands, were terrain changes, landmark changes like Emmerich, for instance, getting the tomb over here, Grimgore starting in a new settlement in Eagle Eries and conquering the province of Gashka-Drak as opposed to Saber Mountain, those kind of things. And just terrain changes, faction changes, minor faction changes over here that did vastly improve the campaigns for everyone in this entire area. And also created a great dynamic as well that the Chaos Dwarves do have to deal with in their campaign. Because you might say, oh, the Chaos Dwarves are powerful. They are. But they are also an incredibly vulnerable race, where if you lose a couple of critical settlements, you might end up just losing a significant amount in the campaign. Losing a campaign, maybe that's a bit of a stretch, but you can certainly end up being bankrupt, not being able to maintain your units, not being able to maintain your economy, your entire industry collapsing into the dirt. Let's first talk about the Chaos Dwarf army and how that plays out. The Chaos Dwarves do have a pretty powerful unit roster, but the only units you can recruit en masse from the beginning of your campaign are all the Hobgoblin units, so Cutthroat, Sneaky Gits, Archers, the Hobgoblin Archers, the Wolf Boys, and then the Orc and Goblin Laborers. Those are the only units you can recruit en masse. Everything else, all the other units, the Artillery, the Centaurs, the Kadai, the Chaos Dwarves themselves, the Infernal Ironsworn units, the Infernal Guard units, rather, they all require you to get armaments. They all require you to get their buildings, to get armaments, to increase their unit capacity through the Hellforge. And if you really want a lot of power, you also need to upgrade these units through the manufactory in order to give them significant combat strengths. But this requires armaments to increase unit capacity, armaments to even construct many of the buildings you're going to be using for these units, and armaments to maintain the unit upgrades through the manufactory. So that means you need factories to produce those armaments, which means you need raw materials, because factories will not work without raw materials, which means you need laborers to run the outposts that produce those raw materials. And those are just three things to mention. And those three things are just to mention with regards to the units. You then need to worry about constructing buildings in a campaign, because the tower buildings, the factory buildings, they require raw materials as well. So you need a lot of laborers. You need to strip mine them via the outposts. And you need to defend these locations. Strip mines, by the way, can be quite expensive in terms of gold. So you're in this position where you want to take quite a few settlements, but you also need to invest a lot of gold, and you need to be very careful with your resources and how you use them in the campaign. Furthermore, laborers are also used for labor action. So if you want money, if you want to have control over a province, if you want to get conclave influence, that's also something you're going to have to deal with in a campaign. And then you have to spend that influence carefully, because you can spend influence to get a settlement as a tower, to get, like, say, a tier 3 tower when you take over a provincial capital. Or otherwise you'll only take a tower as a tier 1 settlement, so you need influence for that. Or you need influence for the Tower of Tsar, or for certain research. Research is also split in this respect. It's split between sorcery, which may require certain things for you to spend conclave influence. It requires armaments for military, or requires raw materials for industry for certain crucial upgrades that you want to use. So like arms monopoly, for instance, which can be pretty solid, or reduced rations that gives you you can then upgrade into 5% casualty replenishment. So you have a lot of resources that you have to spend, and how you decide to spend them, be it with regards to units, be it with regards to buildings, be it with regards to Tower of Tsar, be it with regards to research, and also with the convoys that you can make in a campaign. All of these have pros and cons, like you have risks, rewards, and how you decide to play the campaign, what you're deciding to focus on, is quite important. It means you're vulnerable in the early game in particular. You do have a good early game army in the Hobgoblins, but the Hobgoblins lack one crucial thing. They lack scalability. The real vulnerability of the Chaos Dwarves comes like after, say, turn 20, when your Hobgoblins are just not going to be able to effectively deal with all the powerful armies you're going to start encountering after that point. So you need to construct to get Chaos Dwarf Warriors, you need to get Blunderbusses, you need to get Centaurs, you need to get Great Tauruses and Bull Centaur renders. Artillery as well, quite very crucial to get that. And so you have a lot of choices to make in a campaign, and if you make the wrong choices, your entire empire can end up being vulnerable, can end up being weak, everything can collapse in your face if you screw up as the Chaos Dwarfs. That's what makes it brilliant. That kind of vulnerability that you do have playing the Chaos Dwarfs. Those kind of decisions that you have to make. Another thing to mention with the Chaos Dwarves is, well, a lot of people hate them. And crucially, the factions that hate them are also the factions that surround you. So the Greenskins have a minus 100 aversion against you. The Dwarves have a minus 100 aversion against you. And other factions may not particularly like you, with the exception of Chaos. So Cathay, the Empire, they're all going to hate you one way or another. Being hated by both the Dwarves and the Greenskins, when you're in an area where you have both Dwarves and Greenskins over here, because you are very close to the main Dwarf factions, you're very close to the main Greenskin factions can create a lot of issues. So you need to be careful. You need to consider diplomacy. You need to consider when are you going to attack. Are you going to have to deal with AZAC potentially? Because it could happen if you're playing a Chaos Dwarf campaign. Or if you're, let's take it by campaign. Drazov has to deal with Emmerich, Tretch, Gorst, Greases, and then Karak Azul, and either Skarsnik or Forgrim. Astrogoth has to deal with potentially Azak, Ungrim, and of course Grimgor. Zaytan has Grimgor, and Cathay to consider in terms of his dilemmas. Like, where are you going to advance? Where are you going to progress? Where are you going to build those outposts? You need to build a vast amount of industry as the Chaos Dwarves, but you also need to be careful about that. And then there's Grimgor. Grimgor is an enormous threat in every campaign. Like, look at his situation here. He has 2.5 armies at turn 10 over here. He's wiped out, or effectively wiped out, the Mountain Eaters faction of the Ogres. I declared war on him, but he's got 2 full stacks that he's going to throw against me. And while I also have 2 full stacks, I am bankrupting myself to maintain those stacks to just challenge Grimgor. I think what makes Grimgor such a nightmare is, one, he's probably going to get his items. In fact, he already has gotten his items over here in the campaign. He's going to get those items very quickly. He's going to get a lot of troops very quickly. If we look at the Eagle Ares, he's capable of recruiting nasty skulkers over here, and he's capable of recruiting trolls for this element I'm attacking. Also, pump wagons for all their worth. So he's going to throw a lot of units against me that are quite capable of wiping out my entire army, if I'm not careful, in terms of how I deal with Grimgor. He can be quite a nuisance. He's very hard to kill in individual battles. He can duel your lord and kill your lord pretty easily. And this creates a situation where, regardless of which legendary lord you're playing as the Chaos Dwarves, you basically have an endgame crisis from turn 1 in the form of Grimgor. Now, it's not a guaranteed endgame crisis. Grimgor may end up in a war with Kolek if you're, say, playing Zaytan or Drazov, and he might end up losing or being limited in his campaign. But he can also end up in the situation where he just goes for you because he hates you. He hates the Chaos Dwarfs. He was enslaved by the Chaos Dwarfs. So you end up in this campaign dynamic where you have initial foes, you have potential foes, like let's say as Drazov you have Emmerich and Tretch. You can avoid war with Tretch if you want to. But then you have a guaranteed opponent in the form of Grimgor, who more often than not ends up winning the situation here. And if he avoids a war with Kolek, he is going to demolish everything and everyone that stands in your path. That may include you as well. And that is the dynamic that every Chaos Dwarf Legendary Lord has to deal with in their campaign. On top of the resources, on top of the political system, on top of the unit caps. This is something you're going to have to deal with in every campaign. And if you do manage it, and it's not necessarily so easy, you then have all the factions over here to the west that hate your guts as well. So it creates a great campaign dynamic where regardless of what you do, regardless of where you go, like if you go east in Cafe, well, Cafe is going to fight you. And Cafe is quite substantial at this point. If you go west, the Dwarves, the Empire, everyone there is going to fight you, including Drycup potentially and Kislev. If you go south, well, Emmerich is to the south. And while the only allies you have, and I use the word ally loosely, are potentially the Skaven. Though, how much you want to make an alliance with the likes of Tretch Craventail, that's a different discussion altogether in a campaign. Besides, Tretch has territory that you actually want in the Darklands. So you have this great campaign dynamic where you have a lot of foes. In fact, this is also a campaign where I would recommend probably putting the endgame crisis early and putting it as Dwarves to spice things up as well. It makes for a really interesting, fun, dynamic campaign to play with lots of choices, consequences, risk, rewards. With a huge amount of power potential and the ability to paint the entire map because you're not limited by climate, but with also the risk of everything crashing down on your head. If you don't get good enough units by the point that your enemies hard counter your hobgoblins, you're screwed. If you lose some critical settlements, you're screwed. If you run out of money or laborers, crucially laborers, you're screwed. So, lots of risks. I mean, a competent player will manage this, but it certainly requires more thought, more effort. Like, it's not, like, here's the thing. A competent player, someone who knows what they're doing, will succeed in every campaign. Regardless, it can be Kugaf, it can be Daniel. It doesn't matter. But the process is what's significant. And the process that the Chaos Dwarfs have is that really sweet ground between having a lot of power and steamrolling the map, or having very little power and being incredibly frustrated every turn because you're incredibly limited during campaign. You can still succeed. That's, I think, a point that a lot of people ignore. It's like, oh, you don't know how to play Kugaf. It's like, if I want to play Kugaf campaign, I can dominate the map. That's not the point over there. It's the process in the campaign dynamic, the risk-reward, how satisfying it feels. What's the level of challenge? Is it a frustrating level of challenge where you're kind of bashing your head against a brick wall? Or is it a good level of challenge where you do have powerful opponents, but you also have a huge amount of power potential as well? And that's what I like about the Chaos Dwarfs. And why I think they are much better than any of the Legendary Lords, including Yanbo, who is actually fairly solid. But this is why I think the Chaos Dwarfs are vastly superior to Shadows of Change as a DLC. Costin here, signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications.